Oops. Hello, everybody. Off we go to Chapter 10, which is about monopoly. So in Chapter 10, we look at the distinguishing characteristics of monopoly. Then we look at the determining the optimal quantity of output, and we know that that's going to equal the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then we look at why monopolists engage in price discrimination. Then we have a social evaluation of monopoly. And then finally, we look at the regulation of monopoly using two techniques. One is marginal cost pricing, and then we look at regulation using average cost pricing. Okay, so off to monopoly. Oops. Okay, so we have these three distinguishing features of monopoly. First, we have a single supplier of a product that lacks close substitutes. Secondly, we have barriers to entry. So if the industry earns economic profits, the barriers prevent competitors from joining. And then finally, we have the monopolist is a price searcher versus a price taker that we saw with perfect competition. In monopoly, the firm and the industry are one and the same, and so the demand curve that the monopolist faces slopes downwards to the right, which is different than in perfect competition. The demand curve faced by any particular firm is horizontal. So in monopoly, when the firm increases its quantity supplied, as it increases the quantity supplied, the price declines, and the monopolist has to tinker with its formula to find the optimal profit maximizing point, because both price and quantity change, and that's different than in perfect competition, where the price stayed constant and the firm simply only had to change its level of quantity to find its profit maximizing amount. So in perfect competition, the firm is a price taker, whereas in monopoly, the firm is a price searcher. Oops. Oops. Okay, so one of the distinguishing features of monopoly is the presence of barriers to entry. So we have several types of potential barriers to entry. So one may be sort of exclusive ownership of a particular resource that other parties don't have access to. So one example that I can think of is in some small towns we only have one gravel source. There's only one source of gravel in the area, and one company has the rights to that gravel pit. So if there's only one supply of gravel in a particular area, gravel's a heavy product, so it's costly to transport over long distances. So if one party owns all the natural resource in a particular community, then it becomes a monopoly. Okay, it may be that the industry you're in has difficulties raising capital, and maybe only the first person in the industry is able to raise capital. So that can serve as a barrier to entry. Another barrier to entry is if the industry experiences increasing economies of scale. So when an industry experiences increasing economies of scale, the long run average cost curve is still sloping downwards in the output range. So here's the output range here, and the long run average cost curve is still declining. So as the firm increases its output, it can decrease its price, and that can scare off potential competitors. And companies that have these increasing economies of scale, we'll come back to this in a minute, but they're often known as natural monopolists, or natural monopoly. Oops. Okay. Oops. Helps if I click the next slide. Okay, so another barrier to entry can be so-called predatory pricing. Whoa, better not. So-called predatory pricing. So predatory pricing is where the company lowers its prices in order to drive out competitors, or lowers its prices to keep competitors out of the industry. And then if it drives the competitors out of the industry after they've left, then it jacks the prices back up. Predatory pricing is illegal in Canada under the Federal Competition Act. So it's not that common, but I think the book does have some examples of it. Okay, and then the final type of barrier to entry is if you need to have some kind of a government regulation or government license or government permit to operate, and the government doesn't give those permits or licenses to everybody. So good examples are the banking industry. To operate a bank in Canada, you need to have a charter from the federal government, and not everyone qualifies for those. Likewise, if you're in a profession like you're a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, you have to have licenses to practice in those fields, and so those licenses are ultimately controlled by the government or bodies regulated by the government. If you're in a broadcast industry or in the radio or television broadcasting industry, and you need to broadcast over the so-called airwaves, over the electromagnetic field, the government controls that frequency spectrum, and it sells it to and regulates who can use it. And likewise, if you want to sell alcohol, you're going to have a license from the government, and they might only have so many permits in a particular community. Okay, so one of these barriers to entry that we mentioned was having increasing economies of scale, and increasing economies of scale are associated with so-called natural monopolists. So in an industry with increasing economies of scale, as the total quantity of the product produced increases, long-run average costs decline. So a monopolist that is operating in this section of its long-run average cost curve can scare away competition just by cranking up output and lowering their price. So it scares potential competitors away. So natural monopolists, they tend to have very high fixed costs. So for example, many types of utility companies. So if you're a municipal water supplier, in communities, there tends to only be one municipal water supplier. It's usually the municipality itself. And it's because they have a lot of investment in the water pipes underneath the town. And there's just not enough physical room to have too much competition there. Likewise, natural gas suppliers, in many communities, there tends to only be one natural gas supplier in a particular neighborhood. Likewise, electricity suppliers, there sometimes tends to be only one set of wires in a particular neighborhood. Okay, let's just move on. Okay, so the third distinguishing feature that we mentioned about monopolies is that they're price searchers, and that compares with firms in perfectly competitive industries, which are price takers. So here we have perfect competition, a firm in a perfect competition industry on the left and monopoly on the right. So we know that in perfect competition, the demand curve is the marginal revenue curve, because marginal revenue is only dependent on changes in quantity. Because the price is given, the price is effectively determined by factors outside the control of the individual firm. Whereas a monopoly, the firm is the industry, and we have a distinction between its demand curve and its marginal revenue curve. The marginal revenue curve comes underneath the demand curve. So in a monopoly, marginal revenue depends not only on changes in quantity, but also changes in price that occur at the same time. And so the firm has to search for the optimal quantity price combination that maximizes its profits. Okay. Oh my goodness. There we go. Jeez, this thing is a little bit irritating. Okay. Okay, so an illustration of how the monopolist is a price searcher rather than a price taker. So it's a price searcher because its profit maximizing point of operation depends on it finding the optimal price and quantity combination. So in our little example on the slide here, at time one, the firm's total revenue equals $10 times 7 units, so its total revenue equals $70. And at time 2, total revenue equals $9 times 8 units, so total revenue is $72. So in this little example, our marginal revenue equals 2, and we can intuitively see that the marginal revenue curve is going to be underneath the demand curve because the marginal revenue is 2, and that is certainly less than a price of 10 and certainly less than a price of 9. But that's different than in perfect competition where the demand curve is the marginal revenue curve, and so they're one and the same. So marginal revenue doesn't change based on any change in price. Okay, so the book mentions that the marginal revenue depends in part on the price elasticity of the demand curve, and I was going to try to show that to you. So there's a couple of rules here. So if the price elasticity of demand is relatively inelastic, then price and total revenue are directly related. And if the price elasticity of demand is relatively elastic, then price and total revenue are inversely related. So I was going to try to diagram this, so I left a space. So if we draw our demand curve relatively inelastically and draw some P1, Q1, P2, Q2. So total revenue simply equals price times quantity. So we can see intuitively here, if we, and so the area under the demand curve, where the price and the quantity intersect with the demand curve, represents total revenue. And we can see from this little diagram here that the first box, this the purple box is bigger than the orange box. So if we start at P1 here, our box is this big here, and as our price increases, yes, our quantity decreases, but our box grows in size, and so as our price increases, so our price and total revenue are directly related. Increased price, total revenue increases. So in the if we have an elastic demand curve, so the demand curve is relatively flat, and we have P1, Q1, P2, Q2. So we can see that the first box is quite a bit larger than the second box. So if the demand curve is relatively inelastic, it's a price inelastic. Price and total revenue are inversely related. So as price goes up, total revenue goes down. Just by measuring the size of these boxes, because we've got in the first price, we have this big box, increase the price, quantity shrinks a lot, and the second box shrinks quite a bit. Anyways, so the price elasticity of demand has an effect on total revenue. Okay, so let's just move on. Okay, so the second section deals with determining the profit maximizing quantity, or the optimal level of quantity for the monopolist, the optimal output quantity. So in perfect competition, the firm only has to be concerned with its optimal level of quantity to maximize its profits. The firm only has to be concerned with finding its optimal quantity of output, whereas with the monopolist, they have to be concerned with both the price and the quantity. And just as with perfect competition, we found that the profit optimizing quantity can be found both through the total revenue, so the total approach, so total revenue, total cost, and total profits, and also through the marginal revenue and marginal cost. We have these two approaches. So we can use these same two approaches to find the profit maximizing quantity of output for the monopolist. So if we look at this first approach, we have this little data table here. So here's our quantity level of output. Here's our total revenues in column 3, total cost in column 4, total profit in column 5. And we can see that our profit maximizing quantity, just by eyeballing these total profit figures, is where quantity equals 9. So if quantity is less than 9, profits increase as we increase output, and if output is greater than 9, we can increase our profits by decreasing our output. So using this first method, just by eyeballing this diagram, we arrive at the profit maximizing quantity of 9 units. So likewise, we can arrive at the same number of units by using the second method of equating marginal revenue with marginal cost. So I'm just going to draw a little box on the screen here. So here we have marginal revenues, here we have marginal costs. I wish they had put them in the proper order, but what the heck. And we can see that in when the quantity is less than 9, that marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost for every one of these quantities of output. So if our marginal revenue is greater than cost, we can always increase our net income by producing an additional unit. So our optimal quantity of output has to be greater than 8. And likewise, in this secondary here, so in this section, marginal revenue exceeds marginal cost. And in the second section, marginal cost exceeds marginal revenue. For every one of these levels of output, so 10 all the way up to 15, marginal cost exceeds marginal revenue. So that tells us if we reduce our quantity of output, we can increase our net income by reducing our losses on these particular units, because if costs exceed revenue, marginal cost exceeds marginal revenue, we're losing money on those additional units. So again, using the second approach, we come to the same conclusion as we did with the first approach, that the profit maximizing quantity is 9 units. So of course we can chart all this stuff, we can chart all that data, and we can see the same thing visually. And so that's what we do in this diagram here. So here's the total revenue, total cost, total profit approach. So our profit maximizing quantity is the point on our diagram where the vertical distance between total revenues is greatest over total costs. And so that, just by eyeballing it, we can kind of see it's a quantity of 9. And then likewise in the marginal revenue, marginal cost approach, so our profit maximizing quantity is going to be 9. Why? Because if we produce less than 9, our marginal revenue exceeds our marginal cost in that area. So we can always increase our net income by producing an additional unit. And conversely, in this area greater than 9, marginal cost exceeds marginal revenue. And so if our costs are exceeding marginal revenue, we're losing money on these additional units. And so we can increase our net income, we can increase our profits by reducing our losses by shrinking our output. So again, we come to the same conclusion that the profit maximizing quantity with these two approaches gives us the same result of 9, an output of 9. Okay. Okay, and oops. Okay, and I think this demonstrates the same thing. So monopolists can earn economic profits, and we're going to earn economic profits when the price comes straight off the demand curve. We determine our optimal level of output, and then we read off the corresponding price by going up to the demand curve and then reading off the corresponding price. So we can see that in this, if our quantity is less than this equilibrium quantity here, which corresponds to where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Unfortunately, we have these big blobs on the screen, and it's kind of hard to see very clearly. But we can see that if we have, if we operate in this area to the left, we see that our marginal cost, this purple line, is less than our marginal revenues, which is the red line. And so we can increase our net income by increasing our output quantity, because marginal revenues are going to exceed marginal costs up until this point here, QM. And likewise, if we're operating in this region here, marginal costs exceed marginal revenue, and we can increase our net income by reducing our losses on those additional units by shrinking our output. Okay, so the profit maximizing level of output depends on both quantity and price. So we're going to say that our profit maximizing output is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So here's marginal revenue, the red line, marginal cost is this purple line, and here's our profit maximizing quantity, and the corresponding price is here. So the question is, can we increase our profits by charging a higher price? And the answer is no, because if we try to charge a higher price, our marginal revenue is going to exceed marginal cost of that quantity, and we can always increase our net income by increasing our level of output. So likewise, can we increase our total profits by charging a lower price and selling a greater quantity? And again, the answer is no, because at this output quantity here, and at this lower price, price 3, marginal cost exceeds marginal revenue, and so we're losing money on these additional units, and so we can increase our profits by reducing our losses by producing a lower quantity. So this pushes us back to P1 as being the optimal price corresponding with Q1, which corresponds to the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Same principle that we've seen before. Okay. So monopolists can earn economic profits, and economic profits are the point where price is greater than average total cost. So in our little diagram here, so our profit maximizing level of output is at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So on our diagram, here's our marginal revenue, here's marginal cost, so here's our optimal quantity right here. Here's our optimal price reading off this demand line, the demand curve. And so our economic profit equals price minus average total cost times quantity. So that's represented by this green area on this box. So here's our quantity of 9 units, quantity of 9, and price minus average total cost. I don't have the figures. Oh, we do have the figures. So it's 5.75 minus 4.36, whatever that is. Anyways, so here the economic profit is represented by this green box, because the price on the demand curve exceeds average total cost at this profit maximizing quantity. And as we mentioned before, monopolists are able to earn economic profits because there can be barriers to entry to that industry. So in perfect competition, if we had economic profits in the short run, economic profits would attract competitors into the industry, and that would push out the supply curve, and that would push the price back down to the point where price equaled average total cost, and the economic profits would disappear. But in monopoly, because we have barriers to entry, competitors aren't going to come in to make that economic profit disappear. Okay, so here we've seen that the optimal level of output is a point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost when we have economic profits. So this principle also applies if the industry experiences economic losses. So it is possible for monopolists to experience economic losses if the price, so remember our optimal level of output is at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So here's our marginal revenue curve, here's our marginal cost curve, they intersect right here. Our price is determined by the intersection of this quantity with the demand curve, and then we read off the price of here. So if our price is still below average total cost at this level of output, then we'll have economic losses. So if price is less than average total cost, we're going to have economic losses. So we can see from this diagram that even though the monopolist is experiencing economic losses, this is still the optimal level of output, because if the monopolist produces a lower quantity, we see that this difference between average total cost, the black line, I should go to yellow here, the difference between average total cost, which is the black line, and the price is greater than at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So it doesn't want to produce in that area, it wants to produce to the right of that. And likewise, in the if the monopolist produces a greater quantity, then again, this difference between the average total cost curve and the price, which is described by the demand curve, is also going to be greater than it is at this point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So whether the monopolist is earning economic profits or earning economic losses, the optimal output quantity is still determined at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, so the next section deals with why do monopolists practice price discrimination? Oops. Why do monopolists practice price discrimination? So price discrimination is where the vendor charges different customers different prices for the same products. So in the last few examples that we've been looking at here, in the examples we've looked at so far in this chapter, so for example here, we've assumed that the monopolist is charging all customers the same price. But when we talk about price discrimination, we mean that the monopolist charges different customers different prices. So let's just move forward. Okay, the monopolist charges different customers different prices for the same product. And so when we talk about price discrimination, we mean that the monopolist charges prices as described by the demand curve for different customers. So this customer here gets charged this price, this customer here, customer 2 gets charged this price, this customer here gets charged this price, and so on. And what we're going to see is that by practicing price discrimination, monopolists can increase their economic profits even more. So this idea that monopolists can charge, or companies can engage in price discrimination, it's actually a common practice. It's quite common in the airline industry. If you want to travel to, from Edmonton to Vancouver, and you look at all the different prices for the same flight on a WestJet flight or Air Canada flight, you'll notice that all these different prices are being offered, but it's effectively the same product. I mean, if you take the flight, you're getting to the destination at the same time as every other customer. Your one seat might have a little bit more legroom, but effectively it's the same. Product. And likewise, at many sporting events, hockey games and football games and baseball games, they have all these pricing tiers based on seating positions, but effectively it's the same event, it's the same product, and yet they can get away with charging different prices to different customers, and customers don't mind. Okay, I shouldn't say they don't mind, but they usually don't mind. Okay, so we're going to do an example of how pricing discrimination works, but we're going to see the same principle that we've seen before. Even if a monopolist practices price discrimination, the optimal level of output is the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, so with price discrimination, so here's our data table, here's our level of output. So notice here's our price per unit, so our demand curve slopes downwards to the right. That's what this Schedule 2 is. And here's our new total revenue, where the monopolist engages in price discrimination, charging a different price, so the price changes based on total quantity. So we have a new total revenue calculation, our total costs stay the same, and now we have a new total profit calculation, And again, so we can use these two approaches to determine the profit maximizing level of output. First approach is using total revenue, total cost, total profits. And we can see by eyeballing this diagram that total profits maximize when quantity is 11. So if we're producing less than 11 units, we can increase our profits by increasing our output. And if we produce more than 11 units, we can see that we can also increase our profits by decreasing our output. And so our profit maximizing quantity is 11 units. So we can also use the second approach of equating marginal revenue with marginal cost. And we see the same thing that we saw before. So here's our marginal revenue column, here's our marginal cost column, corresponding to these different levels of output. And we see that in this section here, where quantity is less than 11, that marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. So this tells us that, so marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost all the way along here. So this tells us that we can increase our total profits by increasing our level of output. And in this bottom section here, marginal costs are greater than marginal revenue. Marginal revenue, 11 is greater than 4, 6 is greater than 5. So we can increase our net income by reducing our output because we're losing money in every one of these extra units. So we can increase our net income by reducing our losses on these extra units. So again, we come to the same conclusion that the profit maximizing quantity of 11 units is determined, we get the same result through both methods, either the total revenue method, total cost method, or the marginal revenue equals marginal cost method. Okay, and then I wanted to point something out here. So when the monopolist uses price discrimination, the demand curve becomes the marginal revenue curve. This equals marginal revenue with so-called perfect price discrimination. We're not going to talk about different types of discrimination, but okay, let's just move on. Okay, so if a monopolist practices price discrimination, so remember when the monopolist was earning economic profits, it set its optimal level output at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, so 8.5 units here. And its regular pricing practice is to charge all customers the same price. But if the monopolist practices price discrimination and it charges all these customers different prices, then the monopolist makes this extra level of profits represented by the red area here. Okay, and as we mentioned before, with perfect price discrimination, the demand curve becomes the marginal revenue curve. And with perfect price discrimination, there is no this other curve here. It's the demand curve is the marginal revenue curve. In this diagram, unfortunately, it's not drawn quite the way I would like to see it, because even with price discrimination, the optimal level of output is the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that means in this diagram, if you're practicing perfect price discrimination, that point, here's our marginal cost curve, here's our demand curve, which is our marginal revenue curve. The profit maximizing quantity using price discrimination is up here. So this little illustration only illustrates the concept of additional profits from practicing price discrimination. It does not illustrate the profit maximizing quantity for the monopolist. Unfortunately, it's just a little bit off there. It's not off. It's just that's all the authors wanted to illustrate. Anyways, oops. Okay, so we've talked about price discrimination, and in order for a vendor to practice price discrimination, we have certain conditions that need to be met. And the first condition is that the demand curve that the vendor faces has to be downward sloping, because how else can you charge different prices to people unless the demand curve slopes downwards? And then the second condition is that in order for the vendor to charge different customers different prices, the vendor has to find those different customers. And finding customers is usually a costly undertaking. So in order for the vendor to sell the same product to different customers at the same price, the cost of finding those additional customers cannot be excessive. Otherwise, if the cost exceeds the additional total additional revenue received, then it's not going to be worthwhile. So the vendor has to be able to segment the markets at a reasonable cost. That's the traditional marketing terminology, segmenting markets. Okay. So the third condition here is that the buyers along the demand curve have to have different elasticities of supply, price elasticities of demand. And what it really means is that the customers paying the high price have to have customers paying the high price are in the inelastic section of the demand curve, and the customers at the low end of the demand curve are in the price elastic section of the demand curve. And in order for the vendor to charge higher prices to these customers, they have to have relatively few choices, and the customers at the bottom have to have relatively more choices. Okay, and then the fourth condition for price discrimination, for vendors to be able to practice price discrimination, is that the buyers cannot be able to resell the product to someone else. I mean, the people that buy the product at a low price cannot be able to resell it to someone in the higher market, and so that the customer gains the profits rather than the vendors. So of course that's very difficult to do in the airline industry or tickets to a sporting event. I mean, once you get the ticket in your hand, well, I guess you could have scalping, but anyways, the buyers at the low price have to be prevented from selling to the buyers willing to pay a higher price. Okay, so the next little section looks at the social evaluation of monopoly. Social evaluation of monopoly. Okay, just a sec. Okay. Okay, so we have so in perfect competition, the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity are set by the intersection of the industry supply curve and the industry demand curve. But in monopoly, the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity are not set by the intersection of the supply curve and the demand curve. They're set by the intersection of the marginal revenue and marginal cost curve, which establishes our equilibrium quantity, and then we read the price off of the demand curve. And so we can see from this illustration that in monopoly, the monopolist is inclined to produce a lower quantity than would be produced in perfect competition, and the price will be higher than we would experience in perfect competition. And so in monopoly, we have a shortage of the product, and of course, the monopolist earns economic profits, whereas in the firms in perfect competition break even. They don't earn any economic profits in the long run. So what does this mean? It means that monopolists are not allocatively efficient. So on the demand curve, the price that consumers pay represent the marginal benefit that they derive from the product. And in monopoly, price exceeds a marginal cost. And this means that there's insufficient resources getting devoted towards the production of that product. And so the quantity of output is too low from society's perspective. And so we know that with our production possibilities curve, we're not getting the quantity. We're not at an allocatively efficient point. And also, monopolies are not productively efficient either. They're productively inefficient. Because in perfect competition, firms produce at the quantity where price equals long-run average cost. Because each firm is a price taker. Because if we have any economic profits, we have easy entry into the industry, and the economic profits get competed away. But monopolists do not produce at the point where quantity corresponds to price corresponding to average total costs. And so monopolists produce at the point where monopolists earn economic profits, so price is greater than average total costs. And they produce a lower volume than we would receive at when price equals average total costs. So monopolists end up with the bloated operations because they spend money on unnecessary things because they don't have to be as cost focused as firms in perfect competition. And then another potential ill of monopolies is that they can contribute to unequal distributions of income within society. Monopolists often earn economic profits because price is greater than average total cost. So the monopolists earn economic profits. The monopolist firms tend to be owned by the more wealthier people in society, and so the profits get distributed to a minority of people, and so we have greater income inequality in society. Okay, so again, looking at the social evaluation of monopolies, even though there are some drawbacks of monopolies, we also have some advantages of monopolies. So if the, industry experiences increasing economies of scale, that should say increasing economies of scale, then there might be productive efficiency to the industry because it'd be more efficient to have one large supplier rather than having many small suppliers. Because if you have many small suppliers, they're going to have higher average total costs. And likewise, monopolies tend to be socially acceptable when they're based on patents. So patents give inventors a right to a monopoly on the product for, I think it's 20 years. And patents help encourage innovation, which is beneficial to society as a whole. And likewise, if the monopoly is based on copyright, so copyright is kind of like a patent for artistic works. And again, copyrights grant that monopoly as a reward to the inventors or creators of the artistic works. Okay, so the final section of this chapter looks at two ways that monopolies can be regulated. We have marginal cost regulation and we have average cost regulation. So we mentioned before that we can have these so-called natural monopolies arising. when a single firm can produce all of an industry's quantity at a lower average total cost than many smaller firms. And as I mentioned before, natural monopolies arise when companies have increasing economies of scale and they have very high fixed costs. So with natural monopolies, the long-run average cost curve declines in the output range. And so governments might try to regulate a natural monopolist by forcing it to produce where price equals its long-run marginal cost in order to achieve allocative efficiency. And so we've got a little diagram of this. So here's our long-run, here's a monopolist, here's our long-run average cost curve, here's a long-run marginal cost curve, here's a demand curve, here's our marginal revenue curve. And so the monopolist is inclined to produce where the monopolist wants to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So the monopolist wants to produce at this point here. And the government says, no, you're not producing enough quantity there. You should produce where where the price equals marginal cost. So you should produce at this output level here. So at a higher level of output. But we can see from this little diagram here, a drawback of this is if the price equals marginal cost, but we're still below our average total cost, then the monopolist is going to lose money. And if you lose money, you're not going to be in business in the long run. So this is a drawback of using marginal cost pricing, in that it could force a monopolist to lose money, and they're not going to tolerate that for very long. So the other approach to government regulation of monopolists is average cost pricing. So in this case, the government allows the monopolist to set an output quantity corresponding to the point where price equals long-run average total cost, and the monopolist is allowed to earn a quote-unquote fair return. Okay, so here's our example. So if there was no regulation, the monopolist would be inclined to produce at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So the monopolist would like to produce marginal revenue, marginal cost. The monopolist wants to produce here and charge here. The government says, no, you're not producing enough of your product for society and your price is too high. So the government says, hey, we'll allow you to charge a price equal to your long-run average total cost, so the price comes down and the quantity increases above the point the monopolist would be inclined to produce at. So good news about this approach is the price is lower than the price the monopolist would be naturally inclined to charge, and the quantity is higher than the quantity the monopolist would be inclined to produce, but the quantity is still lower than what we would get under marginal cost pricing, and again the price is also higher than what we would get under marginal cost pricing as well. But it's kind of a happy compromise, and the economist earns a quote-unquote fair rate of return. So it's not suffering any losses, and therefore it can survive. Okay, so that's it for chapter 10, and we'll talk to you later.